and welcome to Author to Author. Today I am going to talk to Ianthomasshaw. He is also known by his pen name Concu. He is a Canadian novelist based in Quebec. He has had a colorful career. He's worked as a diplomat and as an international development worker earlier on in his life. He is the author of Soldier, Lily, Peace and Pearls and Quill of the Dove. He is the founder of Deux Voiliers Publishing, the Prose in the Park Literary Festival and the Ottawa Review of Books. We'll talk about using real-life incidents and situations in fiction stories. Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Right. Ian, you are a seasoned writer. You've been into publishing for a long time. You've done a lot of other things as well. Let's quickly talk about your life. What are you doing currently? What can we expect from you in the future?
Very good. I wouldn't say that I've been at it for a long time. I've been at it for a few years, most of my life, as you mentioned, I've been an international development worker and then as a diplomat doing political work. I just retired in January, and writing has been my creative outlet for about the past 10 years or so, 9 or 10 years. I've always been writing, but I've been writing political analysis and other things, and that's been for a very limited audience, and it's been classified material and stuff in the government, so no one could really read that. And I decided to get into fiction writing because I liked writing. I thought it's nice to write for everybody, something that is accessible to everybody. But you're asking what I'm working on or what's going to be for the future. So I recently did a translation of a novella by a Quebec author, André Graton, and it was called Choosing Eleanor. In the English title, it's called Choosing Eleanor. It's being published by Guernica Editions, and that was just launched a couple of months ago. I'll probably do some more translation, in the coming couple of years. I like to do it. I do it from Spanish into English and French into English. I might try German into English. My German is quite good, but we'll see if there's something there that's worth translating. And as for my own fiction writing, I'm working on a third novel, which takes place in part at the end of the Spanish Civil War in Spain, and also during the Second World War in France. That's one period together. And then the second period is in 2017, 2018, during the bid by Catalan nationalists to become independent through a referendum and the repression of their aspirations for independence by the Spanish central government. And in this novel, there's one main character that appears in the novel as a young man, as a teenager, a boy and a teenager in the first part. And then in the second part, he is an old man. He's 90 years old, and he's been asked by a friend, a young Canadian journalist, to go with them back to Spain and to act as an interpreter for Spanish and Catalan, and also as a facilitator because he knows a lot of the old political leadership of the Catalan movement and also the Spanish left. And of course, their sons and daughters are now involved in politics. So it's two bookends of his life, one as a child and a teenager, and the other as a man who's looking towards the end of his life, who's still active, but the end is coming. And we actually start with the end, and we use flashback chapters to go back and forth between the two periods. The goal of the novel is really to look at conflict. Why are people in conflict? And often people are in conflict over aspirations of the future, what future they want for themselves, and they enter conflicts with other people that have different aspirations. So those are how conflicts are created. But for most of us, we're not really part of that conflict. We are on the receiving end of the violence, of the chaos and all of that. and we're not caught in between these groups that have different aspirations. And then the question is, as human beings, what do we need to do to kind of avoid conflicts? So that's sort of the message behind it, but it's not very explicit. So it's told through the life of this man, how as a young boy he was caught up in this conflict, and then later on, as an older person with a lot of experience, he comes back and he starts to look at the conflict, the two aspirations, the aspiration for Catalan independence and the aspiration for a united Spain. And so this is kind of an interesting, angle when you take a look at it from a very human point of view. He's not an outsider. He is there, but he is the informed observer of this issue of human nature. And I think that the messages there can be applied to many different parts of the world. I mean, Jasveer, I believe you come from India originally. In India, we saw that in 1949 with the division of the country. 47. And, this was based on identity and aspirations. And, at the end of the day, people are still wondering, how this happened, and they also wonder how it can stop, how you can make sure that it doesn't happen again, and probably for most people in 1947, if you were just a Muslim in Mumbai and you're living your life and stuff like that, you didn't want to be part of this. If you're a regular Hindu, you didn't want to be part of it, but the political leadership got caught up with these ideologies, these aspirations of future, feelings of identity, and all of a sudden, millions of people were on the move. Exactly. From one side of the border to the other. So, I'm not an expert in India, but as just an example, this issue of conflicting aspirations for your future and also your understanding of who you are, which sometimes people have very clear understandings of who they are that come from within. And other people accept what they're told by their political leadership of who they are. And they go with that group because they don't know how to extricate themselves from the situation. So in my my second novel, my most recent novel, it was about the Middle East. It's called Quill of the Dove. And it also deals with civilians in conflict and the quest for peace. And in that novel, I have two time periods. One time period is during the Lebanese Civil War, and the period is from 1975 to 82, that part of the Civil War. And the other period takes place in 2007. And the 2007 period, there are three main characters. There's a French journalist by the name of Marc Tarragon. There's a Palestinian dissident leader by the name of Abdallah Akawi. And there's an Israeli left politician, journalist by the name of Jonathan Brunstein. And Marc Tarragon, the French journalist, pulls two friends together to write a private peace initiative to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And they think, what are the things that are really needed to end this conflict? And they all have a lot of weight, a lot of importance in their respective communities, Bronstein and Akawi. And so the idea is they write this initiative on their own, and they try to get international support behind it. And then they want to bring that back to Israel and Palestine and say to the leadership there, look at this initiative, and to get the international supporters to put pressure on the two sides to come back to the bargaining table. However, their initiative is too radical for both sides. And so there are people that want to stop this initiative. And that part of the story is how they pursue the initiative while other people are physically trying to stop it, with violence. So that's part of the story. And the other part in the Lebanese Civil War part, all three of them are in that part, but they're much younger. And Bronstein is in the Israeli army. He's an intelligence officer. The war is on, and so he's part of the invasion of Lebanon. Akawi is a Palestinian fighter resisting the Israelis, and Tarragon is a young journalist at the time, just starting his journalistic career covering the Lebanese Civil War. So you get a lot of information about the Lebanese Civil War, what took place, what the Israeli invasion of it, massacres that took place by various parties in it, and how these three young men, their personalities and worldviews are formed during that period, and later they come together many years later, and their thirst for peace is such they want an end to violence. So it works in flashback chapters, back and forth, which is very interesting, with a lot of backstories for each of them. And I think what's relevant now is there's actually a fictional peace treaty in the book. It's only about 2 pages long, and it's something that comes from my own research and understanding. I lived in Syria, I lived in the Gaza Strip, I lived in Saudi Arabia, in different places in the Middle East, and I was a diplomat that did political work. So most of my life was analysis of this problem and other problems in the Middle East. And I put together what I thought would be a bit of a radical but peace initiative, but one that would actually work if people would stand behind it, if they're willing to make the compromises, because the gap between the two sides has always been fairly large. And so I thought, that's fine, we'll put it in the book. Some people like that initiative very much, and more recently, people have been asking me about that because of the current conflict between Palestinians and Israelis in the region now. And so I think the book is still very, very relevant to what's going on. And it's written by someone who is outside of those two communities. I'm not a Palestinian, and I'm not an Israeli. I'm not Jewish, I'm not Muslim, but my experience with both is being quite extensive. And I try to capture that. If you want to look at this issue in a rational way, and you don't want to write a history book about it or a political science text, you want to write fiction, how could you draw on that and put it together in a work of fiction? I have to say something about the importance of fiction. You can write nonfiction, and most of my life, that's why I've been writing very factual reports about complicated conflicts, and that's fine. But rarely do you influence popular opinion by doing so. What sort of influences people is the storytelling. As human beings, we learn to evolve through storytelling, and storytelling in the form of fiction. So if we look at Western civilization and we want to understand this concept of love, well, often our concepts of love as young people come from fiction, come from the stories that we've read, the stories we've been told, and this is how we see the world, and I imagine it's the same in every culture, that some of the core things in life come from the stories that you've read as a young person and then later as an adult. So if you want to influence how people see certain situations, there are times when you can do it better through fiction than through nonfiction. At the same time, fiction can be very, very detrimental to the way people see the world. And I'll give you one example. Leon Uris wrote Exodus. It was an incredible book, sold millions and millions of copies, became a movie, but there's a lot of falsehoods in the book. And it slanted North American society anyways towards one side of a conflict because it was written in propagandistic terms.
Right.
It was written with deliberate falsehoods. And there are many, many novels that are written with deliberate falsehoods because of the how the novelist, how the author, the writer, has identity with one group over the other, and so fiction can be detrimental, and fiction can also be healing. It can help people come together, and that's what is important to understand, the power of fiction. So that's what I just want to share. Part of my motivation is to try to use writing fiction for good, for helping people understand what human nature is and why conflicts come about, because conflicts come about because of human nature. They can come about because it's very human to seek to identify with other people and to form groups and the like, which is a good thing. That's, you socialize that way, you learn from others. It's a bad thing when fiction pushes you, or your human nature pushes you to identify with one group and then immediately start to exclude another group or become antagonistic to another group because they're not your immediate group. So, we have to understand how human nature is and how we have to a certain degree, control our human nature so that we're inclusive and we don't start to put ourselves in conflict situations of our group versus another group. So that's one thing I want to bring about in my own fiction, is getting back to the fact that we all are human beings. We can understand that we're put in different groups, but we have to avoid this very common tendency to be in conflict with someone who's not in our immediate group. And that's a conscious decision that we make as beings, human beings.
I think the idea is to be unbiased, totally unbiased, not take anybody's side in a very biased manner. But then that happens, that's human nature to be biased about something that you like or you are fond of. And I think it's a radical idea. An Israeli intelligence agent working with a Palestinian for bringing the peace. That's a radical idea. Guys, Quill of the Dove is available on Amazon. Grab your copy now. It's an exciting read. And I'm also excited to read it. Ian, something that really came out strongly from your discussion about sort of using historical events in your fiction story, and this is what I wanted to talk about. It's a big attraction to place your characters in, let's say, a historically important event or a historically important period. There are tons of examples wherein fiction has been placed in real events, right? So there is a parallel story going on over there. How important do you think is it to accurately portray those events? I'll give you an example. U571 was a very successful movie, a very good action movie. But then the fact is it was historically incorrect. You talked about Exodus. U57 was a historical blunder because it was the British Army who had captured the German U-boat. But in the Hollywood movie, it was the American troops which had captured. So it was a blunder, right? Same goes with a lot of other historical fictions. We get history wrong when we talk about fiction. So how important do you think is that in historical fiction?
Well, I don't consider what I write to be historical fiction because the events are still fairly contemporary, within the last 50 years or so. But on the issue of historical fiction, people that write historical fiction, I think it is important to get the broader events, make sure that they're very accurate. If you're going to write a novel that deals with the 7-Year War, you have to get your dates right, and you have to get the major protagonists or the generals right, the monarchs right, whatever it is. But at the same time, you're writing a story, a fictional story. And fiction, by definition, is a lie. It is not the truth. It's not supposed to be the truth. It's supposed to be a story that is made up that could be true. That, you know, in some other universe or whatever, it's a possible that you have to have people see themselves in the character and feel that the characters are real and that storyline makes sense and all of that. But you don't have to bring it down to the level that the interactions of your characters are actual facts, you know, because they're not. They shouldn't be. You know, that's the beauty of fiction. And the readers understand that too, for the most part. But at the same time, the readers want to learn something as well. And if the broader, the next level up of facts are not accurate, then I think the readers get disappointed when they learn that it wasn't true, you know. So why aren't the facts at the next level up? Why aren't they accurate? Why aren't they correct? Well, probably because the writer hasn't done proper research. And sometimes writers who choose to have a setting in a country that's not their own, with characters that don't belong to their immediate culture, they don't take the time to learn about other countries, about the history of that. And they sometimes impose their own prejudices and preconceived ideas on that, and they end up writing with stereotypes, you know, as opposed to something that actually reflects the period of the time, the people that are involved. And that's a big issue, and it's a big issue when you're writing about groups and periods of time where the descendants of those people are still fairly marginalized, and they're not able to present their own works of fiction as they understand their past in their own community. So you end up having Western writers, if they want to write about India. Well, India is not a good example because there's many fine Indian writers, and they write in English and they're in other languages. They're well published. But let's say Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has some good writers, but generally speaking, people don't really know too much about the Tamil, you know, Hindu problem in Sri Lanka. And if someone was to write about it that had never lived in Sri Lanka, that wasn't close to the communities, but for some reason had one friend, you know, a Tamil friend in Toronto, and they've heard some stories from that Tamil friend, they start to write about the conflict, you know, they will inevitably get it wrong, you know, and they will culturally appropriate, you know, and write something that it's not their place to write. So either you do very good research and you do have enough contact with that group of people or those groups of people, and you understand the period to feel comfortable in writing about it in an accurate way, or you shouldn't, or you should stay back, you know. Again, if we want to write about the Roman Empire, well, you have a lot of leeway, because none of us are Romans anymore. I suppose if you live in Rome, you're Roman, but you know, it's so far back that you have more leeway. But if you want to write about something contemporary, okay, then you have to you should be either part of that community, but objective enough to pull back from the preconceived ideas and the prejudices that come from being part of that community and write in an objective way. Or if you're outside of that community, you should have the ability to connect with the people that are in that community and to understand what their emotions are, what their feelings are on both sides of a conflict, for example, and to do very good research and then write about the period. So, I mean, it's one or the other. I was just thinking, again, on the Indian example, remind me, what is the holy city for the Sikhs?
Amritsar.
Amritsar, right.
Yeah.
And what was it, about maybe 20 or 30 years ago, there was a massacre in Amritsar that the Indian, army had taken over, or the police had taken over, and there were Sikh dissidents or Sikh separatists that wanted to create a state.
Golden Temple, or we call it Harmandir Sahib. It's sacramental to our religion. Yes. So the Indian army had taken over that. Yeah.
So that is a very complicated question. I mean, and it could be a very good subject for a novel. I imagine there probably have been novels. I imagine that almost all the novels written have been by Sikhs. That perhaps a Hindu writer or a secular writer has written about it. I don't really know, but that would be the type of subject matter that if anyone else wanted to write about, have that in the story, they would have to do a fair amount of research, and they would have to connect.
Yes.
With both sides, both groups. What was the Indian perspective? Well, I should say Indian, but the Indian government's perspective, those people supporting the Indian government. What was the perspective of the Sikh protesters, and and they could write a very good novel about that if they could do that level of research. Okay. And maybe someone should. Maybe someone should actually come out, and try to have people connect. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, he wrote his biography.
Yeah.
And I like his biography. It was quite good. But then he started to talk about that particular case, and he was very convinced, on one presentation of what happened,
Right.
And from what I've read of it, I'm not so sure that, he was at all objective. I think he, as a young man, he had been told these stories, he had read this, and, and most of what he said was true. But I think there was a lack of context around it. He was too involved in the story,
Yeah.
So I would like to read a novel. I'm sure there are some out there where someone has tried to explain the motivations on both sides and what drove people to this conflict, So maybe you've read something like that. I don't know. Have you read something?
We've got novels and stories by both. Sikh writers like Khushwant Singh. He's one of the prominent writers. He's a great English writer. And then there are books or stories by ex-government officials, ex-intelligence officials, ex-army officials. I think even there is a story about the general who had led the siege at Golden Temple. So he was recently attacked in UK, I think, by somebody. So I think when you talk about historical fiction, there is that touch and go feeling. Even though it's fiction, you still need to get those facts together. You need to do your research, and you need to have an unbiased kind of view about that whole setting. Otherwise, the whole thing goes for a toss, because people might say, absolutely right, there is an agenda behind it. There is a propaganda behind it. The more you try and distort history, the more you would actually fail. And that's currently happening in India. So we can talk about that offline. But yeah, that's currently happening in India. We are sort of trying to rewrite history, and history that was predominantly British history, right? So they say that history is written by those who win the war, right? Our history was predominantly British history for the past 200 years. We've read, we've studied what the British taught us, and our education system is still following the British education system. Though we've been independent for 80 years, we've not made any changes to it. Our laws are still the same. We've got some laws which are about 150 years old. So that explains a lot. We've been independent for 80 years, but we've not change the laws. So yeah, when a nationalistic government comes in, they naturally try and change history which has been read, which has been studied, which has been followed for over 80 years. So yeah, that happens, and same thing happens with storytelling. I think that's so true. And why I wanted to talk about historical fiction is that there is a trend nowadays in India and elsewhere to use history to place your characters, to place your fiction story. And I think it's very important. Hang on, research has to be perfect. You need to know about people. You need to know about the culture. You need to know about exact dates, if historically the dates are available about certain incidents. For example, if your story is being placed in, let's say, Second World War, then you need to at least get the details of the armies correct, details of the conflicts which were going on correct, details of dates correct, when they happened. I think there's a very thin line, even though the story is fiction, yet some of the details need to be real, right?
Absolutely. And in my novel Quill of the Dove, at a certain level was very factual, and I brought it down. So how the main characters, the roles they had, I created battles, small battles that didn't exist, because for the characters to be in that, but it was part of the larger conflict. And I think that's okay in fiction. So you don't have to, and there was one battle or skirmish which took place in northern Lebanon, and to my knowledge there was never a battle like that during the war, but it was useful for the plot. So, but that battle could have been, because in the motivations of the people involved were the same, and they were fighting elsewhere. They had others. But so you can have that degree of fictionalized, events within historical fiction or contemporary historical fiction, if you like, as long as the overall story is accurately portrayed and without bias. It should be without bias. But unfortunately, human beings have learned a long time ago that you can sell stories with a lot of violence, and you can sell stories to one audience if you portray a lot of enemies inside your stories that relate to people that they don't like. Yeah. So that propagandistic fiction can be commercially very successful. And to give you a great example of that is the whole Cold War fiction genre of spies, where the person working for the CIA is always extremely principled and good and courageous, and the person working for the KGB is a devious maniac that tortures people, and they're like that, black and white, and it goes on and on and on, and it appeals to kind of this rather crazed patriotism that they had in the United States at the time. And that type of fiction is, I think, and in the thriller category, you find a lot of that. And I find it's unfortunate. And then you find someone like John le Carré, who really goes beyond all of that. He has flawed characters in his British, spies, and there's no one that's a shining knight or whatever. And the motivations of people on the other side in these spy stories, they're not inhuman people. They also have their own motivations. And then he wrote a great novel which is called The Little Drummer's Girl, which took place in the Middle East, and became a movie. It was quite famous. And he was great in that. He was great in the way he portrayed people in the Mossad, people in the Palestinian, resistance, this young, actress, female actress that gets caught up in this, that's rather naive and the like, and gets manipulated by both sides. So I think writers like him really bring things forward. They produce literature. Other writers produce entertainment. which then gets spinned off into film and the like, and gets even broader audience. So I think there's a sense that writers get of great appreciation when they understand what they've written, whether it's read by 1 million people, whether it's read by 100 people, is actually literature. That there is some type of message that relates to human nature, the human experience, and there's actually some value when people read it. And it doesn't have to be that the writer gives answers in his or her writing. In fact, I forget who it was, but someone said recently in an interview I was watching that the role of the writer is not to give people answers, it's to have the readers ask the right questions. And if they ask the right questions, they will find the right answers themselves, guided by, what they're reading. So an example of that is, let's take just an example what that could be. That could be, for instance, the Rohingya now have been driven out of their country, many of them. Burma or Myanmar is in total chaos. And if a novel is written about that, if the readers, knowing very little about the region, or even being part of those communities, would ask themselves the questions, did this really have to happen? Was this really necessary? The exodus of all these people, that would be, I think, a useful novel. I've got someone working on my house who's come in, but that's okay. It might be a bit of background noise. So over to you, Jasveer. I'm talking too much.
No, something that you said right now, a story that leaves the reader asking all the right questions. I've just recently read a book called The Chalk Line. It's about a young boy who's taken from his family in Kashmir and he becomes a terrorist. Towards the end, there are stories going on from different vantage points, and it all converges in the end. And you actually feel for the character, and suddenly you end up feeling for the terrorist. So, that kind of story I really love. Jane Mitchell did a wonderful job. I don't know if she lived there or how she did it. I mean, she describes the topography, the geography of the mountains, the rugged terrain of Kashmir really well. And the story has been placed so wonderfully well. And at the end, I was surprised. Am I feeling for the terrorist, the little boy who's become a terrorist, who's just killed somebody? And that's the kind of stories that, an author writes. And then you're right, there are entertainers who aspire sort of to make a movie out of their books. So I would categorize them as authors and entertainers. Right? And I absolutely agree. We do need stories, and then real storytelling is when you leave the audience or the readers gasping for more. Leave them with thought-provoking ideas. What next? Why did this happen? And and asking the right questions. That's wonderful. And here's a fun question for you. You've been a diplomat. You've seen the conflicts and different situations really closely. So is it true that a writer can only write to his or her strengths? If I have to ask you to write romance, would you be able to write romance?
Well, I mean, in my novels, there are, romance. There is romance. It does exist. There's love elements here and there. Pure romance as a genre. I don't think I would be motivated. It has to come from your own motivation to write that. I think that there is a problem of the romance genre. Originally, most Western literature the stuff that was really popular was based on romance. Tristan and Isolde, Romeo and Juliet. You know, it was all about the, King Arthur and Genevieve, rather. So it was all about, love and how you couldn't really get together with the person that you wanted because there was some external obstacle, whether it was Juliet's family and Romeo's family or whatever. So that continued, through our history for a long time. But within that, if you, Romeo and Juliet as a play, you learn a lot about the city of Verona. You learn, it's fascinating. And Shakespeare, I don't know if he was ever in Italy, but he certainly had some good research, because he managed to describe, the cities in the Italian Renaissance period in excellent detail inside his plays. So I think that was a very valid genre, and that people were learning from it. They weren't just learning from the romance, but they were learning about other things associated with that. I think more recently, the readership of a lot of this type of romance novels, contemporary romance novels, it's the kind of the Harlequin romance genre, where the story is always the same, and it's very character driven, and you just move the same story into different settings, and then you crank it out very quickly, and then people read it very quickly, and they read the next one and the next one and the next one, without really learning anything about the world, or any deeper understanding about human nature, So that is a pure entertainment genre, and personally, I wouldn't invest my time in that. There should be, I think that it's good to have romance in different aspects of your writing, but purely based on the same storyline about a woman meeting a man who initially she doesn't like, and she finds arrogant or whatever, and then finally she's won over to him, and then somehow they break up and they come together in the end. That basically can be for thousands of novels that plot. So if feelings of romance and this love aspect is very important to you as a writer, I don't think you should make that the only element of your writing. You have to go beyond that. You have to weave that into a plot that's more substantive than that simple plot. However, if you want to sell books, then the way to sell books is to study the best-selling authors and to adapt your book to that, and then do a very strong marketing drive and write lots and lots of sequels to the book and keep people engaged in the book. And that's how, and some romance writers sell, tremendous numbers of books. They have a good income from it. But that's a conscious decision, whether your purpose is to sell books and make money, or if your purpose is to write something which enables the readers to come out of your writing with having learned something, but maybe also having asked themselves certain questions that they hadn't asked before they read what you wrote. And, these are very, very different objectives.
Yeah. I think it totally depends upon the objective, what the author sort of is looking forward to convey, depending upon that. If somebody asked me to write romance, I would tell them, no, my writing is too immature. I would not be able to write romance. I think whenever I describing an action scene, I think it from the point of view of a kid. I might be 40, but my brain is still, I would say 20 or maybe 18. So I think of it from that point of view. Romance is something that I feel is too mature. I would never be able to write. That's what I told one of the bloggers. She asked me, have you ever tried writing romance? I said, no, I've never. We are kind of before we end our discussion, I wanted you to talk about Deux Voiliers a bit. I love the concept, and I'm sure a lot of people are looking to collaborate and come up with such ventures. So let's quickly talk about Deux Voiliers.
So Deux Voiliers Publishing was about 9 years ago, I guess, that we kind of set it up, and we decided that. It kind of morphed into what it became. Initially, the idea was there were 3 other writers who I knew, and myself, when we had just finished manuscripts, and 2 of us. One had put up a manuscript on Smashwords, just in ebook form, because he didn't know how to do layout or anything like that, and he couldn't get a publisher for it, or he hadn't tried very hard. I had done my manuscript, and I had looked at what it took. This is in 2012, about 2011, 2012. What it would take to send this out to all these publishers and finally get it published. And those days, most of the big publishers, most of the significant publishers, still wanted a printed format. So everything had to be printed out and all this type of stuff, and then you wait for a year to get a response. So I decided, no, what I want to do is want to find out if my novel had a readership, if people were interested, get some feedback. So I wasn't looking for that many readers anyways. And I had done some layout in some of my previous work, so I had a concept of how layout should be. And I decided to revive those skills. And so I knew I had certain skills to bring to a writing publishing collective, as well as coordinating it. Then the other writers, they had their novels, they had editing skills. And we came together and we put out 4 books, 1 from each of us. And I learned how to do website design, and we put up a website for it. And we we had them all uploaded to Amazon, which was interesting and practical way of doing it. And then we had we ordered our printed books from Amazon, so then we would sell them to friends who go to book fairs and these type of things, try to get them into local bookstores. So this was the core of it. And then once the website went up, people started to write to us and submitting manuscripts, and we explained, well, this is a writers collective. And so we don't charge any money, and we're not even registered anywhere commercially, and we're not. I made the deliberate decision not to, have any profit associated with it, in order not to get involved with filing tax returns, all this other type of stuff. So we kept it so that nothing would be charged, to anyone. Because it would have been a whole different setup to turn into that type of traditional press. And it actually worked, because once you're not taking any profit, then you can actually get other people to volunteer their services as editors, proofreaders, doing layout for free, pro bono. Mm-hmm. And their interest is maybe they're working on a manuscript, and then they would count on other people to do that work on their manuscript. So it became a real collective, almost as a self-help collective. But where we drew the line was we had editorial control about what we were going to publish. And if it wasn't good, and usually that meant if you sent to me, I'd read it. And if it really wasn't good, I would just say, thank you, it doesn't work. And if it showed potential, I would send it to another one of our member authors who was writing in that area, and get that person's opinion. If that person thought it was good, had potential, then we would start to work with the author to improve it. And, and with some structural, developmental edits, changes in the plot, indicating where the character development was weak and all that type of stuff. So we replicated essentially, through the use of pro bono work, the same process that existed in traditional publishing in major publishers, not in smaller publishers, because smaller publishers, sometimes they don't have a lot of time to do editing. Right. And they put out stuff that really needs a lot more editing, especially developmental editing, simply because they don't have the time, they don't have the staff, they don't have the money. But because we were all doing this pro bono, we actually had a lot more time to spend on manuscripts. And then the books started to come out, and our goal was that everyone should get, one book published. And then after they got the book published, they should move on to trying to get their second books published by a traditional publisher, which would have better distribution, would sort of, help them in their writing career. And that happened for about half of the people contributing. They got publishers for their second books or third books. Some of them won awards. I benefited that way. And about 2018 or so into 2019, we had met most of our aspirations, the original group, the group that joined the first 2 or 3 years. And our focus was elsewhere, but we continued to publish, 2 to 4 books a year. And since 2019, we haven't published anything. I'm thinking about what we want to publish. But right now with COVID-19, the distribution would be so difficult to build the readership that people might be quite, disappointed, and even with small presses, it's the same thing. And I think this is something that we have to recognize, that since this pandemic, traditionally published authors with small presses are not gaining much readership because the reality is the bookstores are mostly closed, or for a lot of the time, and book launches on Zoom are nice,
but not effective.
But not effective because people don't, you can put out the information of how people can order the books, but once they've seen the Zoom presentation stuff, usually they don't bother ordering the book. If it was a good friend of theirs, they would have ordered the book before, the book launch anyway. And so, but when you're actually in a bookstore or some other venue for a book launch, and you've gone there and you've had a drink of wine or whatever it is, you're part of that, then you'll put down the $20, $25, $15, whatever it is, and you'll buy a copy of the person's book, right, and get them to sign the book. But the virtual launches aren't really working that way. And so it's become difficult, I think, for authors to sell their books. Those that continue to sell books are the authors that have been online, often self-published authors that have a following, and people are at home and they will, with their Kobo or Kindle or whatever, they'll buy an ebook, and doesn't cost that much, and from their favorite author, just for something to read, So those people continue to have sales, but for the paperbacks, I think it's become very, very difficult. So as COVID-19 eases up, as bookstores get going, literary events get going, that's the other thing, literary festivals have also gone online. And we have a large one here in Ottawa, which is called the Ottawa Writers Festival, or International Writers Festival, and they have it twice a year. And I would go to that, and you would listen to the authors speak and read and all of that, and there'd be a bookseller there, and I'd pick up, if I liked what I heard, I'd pick up a book and have the author sign it, and then I knew more about the author, and I could talk about that author. So those kind of that's the grease, that's greasing the wheels, right? Because you get that going, and then the author has a reputation, and you have CBC radio talking about the books and stuff like that, and then people actually go out and buy books. So we're in a tough spot right now, I think, for the publishing industry.
I think not just publishing, but a lot of other sectors are also in a really tough spot because of COVID. And let's hope this all gets over very soon. But Ian, thank you so much for taking time out. It was a lovely conversation. And I think in the end, we can all agree that there is editing and then there is developmental editing, and you need, if your book it has to be good, and I mean really good, it needs real good developmental editing. And ventures like Deux Voiliers, wherein a lot of authors have collaborated, can really work. And you guys have done a wonderful job in launching at least 20 books. You guys have been a launch pad, and I think that's really good work. And I hope post-COVID, Deux Voiliers keeps doing the good work. All the best for that. And I also look forward to a lot of work from you. I like your style of using real life situations and events in your stories. Of course, a part of it comes from your experience as a diplomat, but I really love the thrillers. I am a big fan of the thriller and fiction genre. Hope to see a lot more work from you. Thank you so much for taking time out here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jasveer.
Right, guys. So that was Ianthomasshaw, aka concu for you. I'll be back with another episode shortly. Till that time, take care and have a great day. Thank you so much for taking time out.